Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Doug, and thank you to the foundation for inviting me. It has been a sort of long time in the making, as was referenced there, and it's just a real delight to be here. Thank you to all of you for taking the time to come out and think together about things that really do matter to us as Christians, and yet often, I think, aren't given the attention that they deserve. So I'm thankful to you for being here. It's a privilege to share the platform with Dr. Renahan. He was probably one of the people who was most influential through his published works and lectures and talks available online in sort of getting me interested in thinking more deeply about the history of the Second London Baptist Confession and what that means. And so I'm grateful to him, and thank you for your ministry and your work, Dr. Renahan. All right, so in terms of what I'm going to be talking about with you, we're going to be thinking about any number of developments related to the emergence of these first early modern English Baptists, the very folks that Dr. Renahan was talking about in his talk. And in this opening talk, I want to sort of set the stage by laying out various sort of foundational pieces that my hope is will set a context for what's to come in my further sessions. And some of it's going to intersect very nicely with what Dr. Renahan was presenting to us already this morning. And again, just so we're on the same page, if you'll hear me use that phrase a lot, early modern English Baptists. When we talk about the early modern period, if that's new to you, we're talking about, a lot of historians divide sort of the modern era as opposed to the medieval era that preceded it. They take that as starting around 1500. So if we talk about early modern, we're just talking about the early portion of that modern era. Usually between 1500 and 1800 is how most historians kind of divide that up. And the folks we're interested in are coming out of that early modern period. And my goal here in this first session, again, is to set the stage by thinking about three interrelated developments that sort of prepare the way, as it were, for the emergence of early modern English Baptists. And the way I'm kind of trying to frame it is to think about it in terms of three different senses of independence that developed in this early modern period in an English-speaking context. One of the words that was used for Congregationalists that we've been speaking about was, in fact, independence, because they wanted a particular kind of independent church structure. But actually, when we think about Protestantism more generally, I think that word independence has a great deal of relevance. It's an interesting term. It's a relative term, right? If we talk about being independent, we immediately want to ask, well, independent with respect to what? Free from what? Independent from what? And so to start us off here, I want to think in terms of three different senses of independence that are relevant to our Reformation story and ultimately to our Baptist story. So first, I want to take us through and think about independence from the Roman Church. Just think briefly about the Protestant Reformation more generally, conceived of as a kind of independence from Rome. Then I want to think a little bit about independence from the English Church, the origins and rise of English separatists, some of the people that Dr. Renahan was talking about. Another kind of independence. And then third, I want to think about independence from the idea of a national church, the origin and rise of English Congregationalists. And again, this brings us to Henry Jacob, that Dr. Renahan was introducing us to just moments ago. And the interesting thing about these three senses of independence is that they sort of move in order. This is roughly a chronological flow, but it's also, I would argue, a logical flow. There's a logic to these different independencies, and each one sort of sets a context for the emergence of the next. And then the fourth stage in this progression is, of course, the development of early modern English Baptists or Baptistic Congregationalists, which I'll talk about in subsequent talks. But this is a sort of stage-setting exercise in broad brush, three senses of independency that sort of move and develop together. So let's think about it and set the stage together. And we'll start here with independence from the Roman Church, the origins and rise of English Protestants. Now, again, my purpose here is not to really rehearse the series of events that led to and advanced the English Reformation. Those are stories worth telling. Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary Tudor, Wycliffe, Cranmer, Ridley, those names are all worth talking about, but that's not our purpose here right now. Rather, by beginning with independence from the Roman Church, my aim is to draw our attention to the fact that ecclesiastical independence, sort of conceived of as freedom from an ecclesiastical structure deemed to be out of step with Scripture, that sort of independence was really at the heart of the Reformation project. It was really the animating force in many ways for the Protestant Reformation, generally speaking. It really is a part of Protestant DNA. And what we see, and what I find interesting in this context, is that as we move into the Reformation era and the English Reformation and what's sometimes called the post-Reformation period, one of the enduring questions for Protestants of every stripe was, when does Reformation go far enough? And how do you tell the difference between further Reformation and some sort of sinful novelty? That was an enduring question. What do I mean? Well, to get into these themes, think about a letter that was written in 1546 from the English teacher, pastor, preacher, theologian John Hooper to the Swiss reformer Heinrich Bullinger. And Bullinger was a very important figure for the Reformed tradition. He was the successor to Zwingli in Zurich. And he's often conceived as one of the architects of covenant or federal theology and other pieces of Reformed theology that are very important to us. And Hooper, the Englishman, he greatly admired Bullinger. Many English reformers greatly admired the reformers on the continent, the reformers originating in Switzerland and spreading out from there. And indeed, you see this despite the fact that Hooper was almost 10 years older than Bullinger. When he writes to him, the English theologian shows great deference and respect upon his Swiss counterpart. He addresses him as most honored master, most loved brother in Christ. And he describes in this letter his own growing regard for Reformation theology. It's a fascinating letter. He talks about how the things that he used to regard as actually pious Christian practices, he gradually comes to see that these were actually, in his own description, idolatrous blasphemies that he lumps under the label of popery. And he wants to be free from it. In other words, Hooper is describing becoming a Protestant. And despite his own feelings of gratitude towards Bullinger as being one of the authors that he was reading that was helping him come to Reformation conviction, despite his gratitude that the English church had moved away from the Pope in Rome, Hooper makes clear he's really not satisfied with the state of Reformation in England. Listen to how he describes the situation to Bullinger. He says, "Accept, my very dear master, the news from England. As far as true religion is concerned, idolatry is nowhere in greater vigor." So again, he's writing in 1546. He's well into the process of Reformation in England. And he says, idolatry is nowhere in greater vigor. He says, our king, Henry VIII, has destroyed the Pope, but not popery. The impious Mass, the most shameful celibacy of the clergy, the invocation of saints, auricular confession made aloud to the priest, superstitious abstinence from meats, and purgatory were never before held by the people in greater esteem than at the present moment. Now, notice two things about Reformation in England, according to Hooper. First, you'll notice that he conceptualizes Reformation in terms of being set free from Roman Catholicism, or at least aspects of Roman Catholicism, being released from under the yoke of religion, liberated from the bondage of popery. He wants to be free from idolatry, free from the cult of the saints, free from superstition. In other words, Hooper wants independence from the Roman Church. And second, you'll notice that for Hooper, this sought-after independence from Rome is not something that happens all at once. He's not seen it as a on-off switch. Rather, he's seen Reformation very much as a process. Hooper, again, writes these words in 1546, so 12 years after Henry VIII broke things off from the Pope, and yet he still describes England as caught up in the grip of idolatry. Our king, he writes, has destroyed the Pope, but not popery. So for Hooper, independence from Rome is what English Protestants want, and in some sense they've got it, but actually there's a lot of work to be done. It's a journey, ongoing, dynamic journey. This idea of Reformation is ongoing, very deeply embedded in Protestant DNA. It's interesting to me, we being us, 20th, 21st century folks, we often describe and talk about the Reformation with a capital T and a capital R as though it were sort of an event, right? Like World War I, a discrete historical happening with a start date and an end date. It's a thing you can talk about. 2017, not that long ago, we celebrated the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, dating it back to Luther and Wittenberg. And again, there's nothing really wrong with that, right? For the purpose of thinking about things and writing books and giving lectures and talking together, you need sort of conceptual coat hooks, right, to hang your thoughts on. So there's nothing wrong with it, really. But we should be aware of the sort of potential for a bit of sleight of hand. Because actually, people at the time, they didn't really see it like that. The men and women who were living through the Reformation wouldn't have necessarily understood it as an historical, discrete event that happened and then was done. Rather, particularly among English Protestants, there was this real sense of Reformation as ongoing. And it is possible to have degrees of Reformation. It's possible to be more or less reformed. And this was something they talked about a lot. So, in other words, then, Reformation for them, it's not a sort of discrete happening like the Battle of the Somme or the Treaty of Versailles, but rather it's something that unfolds over time that you want to pursue and continue to pursue as church leaders. It's something that could be slowed or hindered by various events. It could be reversed. Reformation could go in the wrong direction. All of these things happen, they unfold, and Reformation can't be, in the minds of these folks, definitively concluded, at least not until our Lord returns. So, all right, that's fine, that's all well and good, but you ask, why is this important as we try to get a handle on the origin of congregational principles? Well, I think it's important for us to see Reformation as a dynamic concept because we want to understand that when we're dealing with English Protestantism, we are very much dealing with folks who saw the Reformation as unfinished, and they saw it as their burden, or at least many of them did, their burden, their duty, to help further it. And when we start to think about the logic of congregationalism, we need to view it through that lens. This is how they understood what they were doing. They were pressing on. One person, Presbyterian minister, put it as, we want to reform the Reformation itself. So there you get a sense of that dynamic press. And so one of the great difficulties then, as I mentioned, in thinking about all this stuff for Protestants in this early modern period was, how do you know when to halt this onward roll of Reformation? Now, obviously, if you're defining it as reformed according to the Word of God and bringing your practice more into conformity with Scripture, then you don't want to stop, right? You can never be too close to Scripture. And yet the problem is these folks didn't always agree on what represented conformity to Scripture. There were many disagreements, vigorous disagreements, over what constituted an actual act of reformation according to the Word of God and what constituted something less helpful, even something in certain cases bordering on sinful schism. So this is a question that they had, and to illustrate it, think of this telling exchange involving the congregational minister Philip Nye. This was during the mid-17th century, and Nye was confronted by someone who disagreed with him with clear evidence that some of his own favored positions on ecclesiology were at odds with the current practice of what the document describes as the Reformed churches. So they say, Nye, you, brother, are out of step with the Reformed churches. I have the receipts. Look for yourself. And his response is interesting. He said to this person, well then, you ought to pray Reformed churches may be reformed more than they are. That's interesting. His sense of the word reformed, dynamic, unfolding, on the move, semper reformanda, all of these things. And there you see the problem, though. If you and I disagree over some matter, and I seek to go my own way, and I then move away from you, maybe break fellowship in pursuit of this new ecclesiological conclusion, am I actually pursuing further reformation and godly independence from lingering vestiges of Roman Catholicism? Or am I diving into sinful schism? That's the conversation they were having. Let me give you one more example of this. This is during the English Civil War, and you had a fellow called Marchmont Needham, who was a popular pamphlet writer, and really, if he were operating today, we'd call him a journalist. They didn't have that term, but that's what he was. And he was also a proponent of congregational ecclesiology. And he wrestled with this very problem as he replied to Presbyterian critics who were accusing Needham, and accusing fellow Congregationalists of this very thing. They're saying, y'all are in sinful schism by pursuing this independent church way. And so he writes a book, title sort of quite on the nose, Independency, No Schism. And listen to what he says. He says, if Luther's departing from popery was no schism, if the First Reformation in England was no schism, by which he means Henry VIII breaking from the Church of Rome, if the Presbyterians late departing from prelaty, by that he means Episcopalian polity, rule by bishops in a hierarchical structure, if all of this was no schism, but were all, this is a key phrase, all degrees of reformation in their times, how comes it then that this more spiritual church way of independence, which aims at a yet more perfect reformation, should bear an imputation of schism more than the other? At present, Satan may endeavor to blast it with the name of schism, as he did former reformations, which succeeding years may acknowledge for the right way. So here, then, I think we find distilled for us the essential difficulty that were facing some of these folks in the early modern period as they were debating, particularly matters of ecclesiology. All agreed that it was good and right to find independence from the Pope, but what of, to borrow again from Hooper's letter, what of lingering popery? And there was some debate and some dispute. And what one saw as a lingering vestige of popery, another saw as actually the road that we ought to continue on. How far do we go pursuing independence from that? Well, some wanted to go much further than their contemporaries. That brings us to the second dynamic that we want to explore, and this begins to touch more closely on what Dr. Renahan was presenting to us. We want to think about independence from the English church, the origins and rise of English separatists. And our second development brings us English separatists, men and women who, as the name suggests, wanted to separate themselves from the Church of England. They wanted to seek independence from the English church. And there's different ways we could think about these folks, but for our purposes here, I like to think about them as people who took that basic Protestant logic about which we just spoke, of seeking independence, not just from the Pope, but from lingering popery, and they wanted to push it out even further than most of their contemporaries did. They wanted to push it out further. They were, English separatists were drawn from the ranks of folks that we could regard as English Puritans. And in fact, one way to think about separatists is that they were kind of like, really quite intense and fed up Puritans. The Puritans as a group were already kind of intense, fed up folks, and these people were even more so. And note on that word, Puritan, it came about during the reign of the decidedly Protestant, though not necessarily Puritan monarch, Elizabeth I. And it was first used as a term of abuse, but eventually as a way of self-identifying. The Puritans were people who, speaking roughly, wanted to purify the English church of what they regarded as further vestiges of lingering popery. And they wanted to eliminate various things. And they were looking in their inspiration for what they wanted to get rid of to the Reformed tradition on the continent. So they were looking to continental Reformed folks originating again from Switzerland and spreading out. And in fact, many English reformers spent time on the continent in exile. When Mary Tudor was coming to power, she got the name Bloody Mary because she was executing so many Protestants, and many reformers in England said, okay, the temperature's getting a little hot here, let's take a time on the continent. They learned a lot of things from Reformed pastors over there and took it back. And they came back and they said, you know what, ours is a church but halfly reformed. Another phrase that illustrates that dynamic nature of reformation. It's not just sort of on-off switch, it's actually an unfolding process. And these folks were very frustrated. Again, they returned from the continent, they've learned from folks over there, and Elizabeth takes the throne and it's safe to come back. Bloody Mary is gone, we can come back, and they're all really hopeful and they're all really excited about what might happen. Because unlike her predecessor, Elizabeth I was, again, decidedly Protestant. She had no desire to reunite with Rome. And yet, despite that enthusiasm for Protestantism, Elizabeth proved a very frustrating figure for English Puritans. She would never see things as they did. And in fact, after she passes acts of supremacy and uniformity in 1559, towards the start of her reign, she's pretty much, in her mind, done with kind of further reformation in the church. With the 1559 legislation, she wanted everybody in England on the same religious page. And doctrinally, theologically, it was a decidedly reformed page. As Dr. Renahan mentioned, the 39 articles of the Church of England, the doctrinal sort of standard that she adopts, explicated in the Book of Homilies, these were decidedly reformed statements in many, many respects, Calvinistic in their soteriology, and so on and so forth. However, despite some of the theological stuff that the Puritans would have liked, Elizabeth maintained a lot of other things, particularly to do with ritual, to do with liturgy, and to do with the structure or ecclesiology of the Church of England. She retained all of that. And so in some respects, the Church of England was in step with the continental Reformed churches, and in other key ways, it was very much out of step. That's the basic dynamic. And for Elizabeth, she thought that what she got in 1559 was basically good enough. Let's leave it be. She's thinking, I have other problems to worry about. We have, Spain trying to invade us and other pressing issues. I'm done with the religious question. In fact, many refer to what Elizabeth established in 1559 as the Elizabethan settlement. And that's a good word, because in her mind, religious questions were now settled. We don't need to argue about these anymore, fellas. It's good enough. Except the problem was, for many English folks, it wasn't good enough. Now, again, thinking back to that idea of Reformation as a dynamic unfolding, degrees of Reformation, we want a more thorough Reformation, we want to reform the Reformation itself, all that language. If you think about it in that respect, you can see that from that perspective, the idea that religion is settled is sort of wrong-headed, right? Because, well, hold on, shouldn't we constantly be going back to our Bibles, constantly thinking together, asking together, searching the scriptures daily like the noble Bereans to see if these things were so? So the Puritan mindset was very much one of, hey, it's not settled, and there's actually a lot of things that we're unhappy with. What were they unhappy with? Well, all sorts of things. Many of these will be familiar to you. They were upset with things like they didn't like clerical dress. The Church of England ministers were wearing robes that were sort of priestly garments. Again, a lot of the Reformation, I think, can be helpfully conceived as trying to they're finding sort of what they regard as inappropriate carryovers from the Old Testament into New Covenant worship, and the clerical dress was one of those, right? Priestly garments. They didn't like that. They wanted to wear academic robes. And interestingly, this would be an interesting subject in itself, but what you wear in the pulpit sort of reflects what you think the guy in the pulpit is all about, right? What is your conception of ministerial identity? And if you identify the minister as one whose chief occupation is to be performing the sacrifice of the Mass in priestly fashion, in sort of quasi-Levitical fashion, well then of course he should wear priestly robes that sort of resemble in some way, shape, or form the robes of the Levitical priesthood. But if you see the minister's job as to rightly divide the word of truth, then it's a word-centered ministry, and it makes sense that these guys thought, actually, no, we don't want priestly robes, we should wear academic robes, because actually this is a task of rightly dividing the word of truth, which requires going deep into the scriptures and then presenting it to the people for their edification. Different conceptions of ministerial identity lead to different dress in the pulpit. So anyway, they didn't like things like that. They didn't like things like making the sign of the cross at baptism, which was a part of the Church of England's liturgy. They didn't like things like wedding rings given at the marriage ceremony. Now, I'm wearing mine. Why didn't they like it? They didn't like it because our Roman Catholic friends, of course, regard marriage as one of the 7 sacraments of the church. And a sacrament needs a sign. And a wedding ring is a visible token. And so they saw the wedding ring as sort of tied up with the whole sacramental understanding of marriage. So they wanted it gone. What else didn't they like? They didn't like kneeling at communion. Now, we should just be clear, they weren't opposed to kneeling, per se. I notice there's very lovely kneelers here in the pews. They were not opposed to kneeling in prayer. In fact, you can find many Puritans saying kneeling is an appropriate posture for prayer. They didn't like kneeling before the Lord's Supper, because to kneel before the host, before the bread, implied you were, worshiping a consecrated host, the real presence of Christ. So it was all bound up for them with these deeper theological concerns, and they saw those deeper theological concerns reflected in these outward signs and forms. So they had this whole complex of things that they said, hey, we need to get rid of. And of course, for many Puritans, though not all Puritans, we should say, but for many Puritans, episcopacy itself was a big problem. The whole ecclesiological structure, a hierarchical church structure with bishops and sort of descending power down in hierarchy, that was a big problem for many Puritans. They looked at Presbyterians on the continent, even Scotland now is getting on the Presbyterian train to some degree, and they said, why can't we have that in England? So here's their problem. What's to be done? Puritans, they tried all sorts of things under Elizabeth, trying to get some of these changes effected. What did they do? Well, for starters, some tried simple non-compliance or non-conformity. So the Crown says you need to wear such and such in the pulpit. Well, you just don't do that. You don't conform. That's the most sort of easy, obvious way. Some of them did. So, for example, when the Elizabethan church demanded that all clergymen wear a white surplice, which is a white tunic of sorts that would be worn over a traditional black cassock, Reform-minded Puritans wanted nothing to do with that for the reasons that we were describing. And they felt strongly about this. One Puritan wondered this. He said, why would it be acceptable for a minister of Christ to wear the rags of Antichrist? So again, you can see this was a strongly felt conviction. And anyway, many Puritans refused to wear the surplice. Well, how did that go? Not very well, as it happens. In fact, most of the things the Puritans tried on a sort of formal, official level didn't go well. This didn't go especially well. Just to give you a little insight into that, 1566 in London, 140 of the city's non-conforming ministers, again, this is just in London, it's a lot of churches, 140 of the city's non-conforming, surplice-refusing, Puritan-minded ministers were brought before ecclesiastical authorities and presented with a very simple choice. You either sign this paper promising before God that you will wear this surplice every time you preach, or you can just get out and we will deprive you of your living, to use the terminology that they would have used. We'll deprive you of your pulpit and your salary and all of that. So simple and stark. And it's interesting, Puritan ministers had to grapple then with this question. And it's a question actually at its root. We're not necessarily faced with this question of a state church demanding you wear a certain thing into the pulpit, but the dynamics of the question are actually quite perennial, aren't they? Here, Christian pastors are told, you need to make a compromise, and they had to ask, is this compromise imposed on me by this external authority? Is this sufficiently egregious that I cannot go along with it no matter what the cost? We have these discussions in our own day. They look different, but every age has to wrestle with this sort of thing. Does signing this paper and agreeing to conform amount to me actually denying Christ? And I can't do it, whatever the consequence. Or is it actually, in the particular case under question, is it actually just an outward thing with little real consequence? Some of them are thinking that. They're saying, look, yeah, sure, I'd rather not wear that surplice. If I had my choice of the matter, I wouldn't dress like that. However, at the end of the day, is this really worth losing my living over? And before we dismiss that line of thinking too hastily, for many of them, they felt this burden. They said, you know what, look, it's a state church. If I get kicked out of this pulpit, someone will be put back in it. And there's no guarantee that the person who gets put back in will be a gospel-preaching, Christ-affirming, five solas promoting minister. So if I make a big deal out of this surplice, am I actually just depriving an untold number of an authentic gospel ministry? Is that a good trade-off? Is that appropriate? What do I do? It takes wisdom. And interestingly enough, for what it's worth, make of it what you will, but on that day in 1566 in London, faced with the choice to either conform or lose their livings, most of the Puritan ministers chose to conform. Said there were 140 some who were faced with this choice. 103 signed the statement promising, yes, I will wear the surplice. 37 refused, and they were deprived of their pulpits. Did their sacrifice reflect wisdom or not? Interesting question. My strong suspicion is that if all of us in this room were transported back into the 16th century and faced with a similar choice, just looking at the numbers of what actually happened, remember, all these people thought it was wrong to wear the surplice. I suspect we'd have disagreement amongst ourselves. Interesting. Wisdom issues. In any event, Puritans were trying to do all sorts of things. They're trying to make a dent in what they saw as this sort of popish vestiges hanging on. They really weren't very successful, at least not in a formal, outward sense. In addition to simple disobedience, they tried other things. So some tried the kind of most official route of all. They tried the legislation route. Let's introduce, legislation that will kind of actually formally change some of these things we don't like. That makes sense. And sometimes they got pretty far in terms of introducing bills into the House of Commons, and they had some success. But every time, the Crown found a way to sort of pump the brakes on that, and it never actually went where they wanted it to go. And there were different sort of political strategies employed to do that. But suffice to say, they never got anywhere really on that score. And you can imagine then that among the Puritans, different temperaments are going to respond differently to this cycle of hope and disappointment. Oh, hope, maybe this will work. Oh, no, it didn't work. Oh, this should be good. No, it won't. That's kind of the story of Puritanism, at least in an outward, formal way. They get excited. This will do it. Ooh, this monarch will be different. Actually, not so much. There were some victories. There were some more bitter defeats. But the general trajectory was, oh, this will work. No, it won't. And you can imagine then that for different ministers, they're going to respond to that differently, right? The Lord has made us to differ. We all have different temperaments. And some Puritans responded to this lack of success by kind of focusing their efforts more internally. They say, okay, you know what? I'm never going to change the Church of England at the highest levels, but here's what I can do. I can put my head down and get to work faithfully ministering where God has put me, and I can actually make a real difference in the lives of these men and women who are under my spiritual care. And so you actually see, despite the lack of outward success at the highest levels, you actually see an incredible blossoming of rich theology and devotional literature and works that are still read today by Christian men and women looking to be edified. And so in that sense, the Puritan movement was a huge success. We continue to benefit from their spiritual fruits today. So that was one thing. But other people didn't like that idea. That seemed defeatist. That seemed like compromise. That seemed like the way, perhaps, of the coward. And they said, you know what? Enough of this. I'm not going to compromise with Antichrist. To certain casts of mind amongst the Puritans, any sort of compromise just felt like a non-starter. We can't do it, and they wanted to pursue more radical paths. And indeed, after the Parliament of 1572 failed to achieve any real victories for the Puritan party, we see two young London ministers named John Field and Thomas Wilcox, who declared ominously in an illegally printed pamphlet that, quote, "We have used gentle words too long." Well, what did they want? As they put it in their pamphlet, they wanted to remove whole Antichrist, both head, body, and branch. And so for them, reforming the Church of England meant actually not just tinkering around. I'm not satisfied with just, okay, the sign of the cross of baptism is bad, but that's small potatoes. We've got to remove the whole thing, root and branch. For them, they needed not just these tweaks, but they wanted to actually see the whole Episcopalian polity gone. And they wanted a Presbyterian system of government. They're pushing for that openly. And these were not gentle words, as they said. They were strong words. And yet, as it turned out, even the strong words of Field and Wilcox actually, in the end, proved every bit as ineffectual as the gentle words of their more irenic contemporaries. Gentle words didn't work. Strong words didn't work. Nothing's going to change this Church of England. And some Puritan types are getting more and more fed up, and eventually they decide, you know what, we are just going to leave it all together. We're done. We can't reform it. It's not worth the effort. I've only got one life to live, and I'm not going to spend it dealing with this popish nonsense. That's the mindset. And so they wanted to gather congregations that severed all connection with the Church of England because they regarded it as a lost cause. There's no realistic hope of reforming. And this brings us to a gentleman that Dr. Renahan spoke to us about, Robert Brown. And he's one of the first and still most well-known of these separatists. In fact, he's so closely connected with the cause of separatism, separating altogether from the Church of England, that often in the literature and in contemporary documents, separatism is often referred to as Brownism. So he gave his name to this. Who was he? He was a minister in Norwich. described as one historian as, quote, an imperious, energetic young Puritan preacher with a swelling hatred of the bishops and growing impatience at any compromise with them. And so by the 1580s, Brown had concluded that through its failure to reform itself rightly and its failure to administer church discipline properly, the Church of England had been left with, quote, no name nor show of the Church of Christ remaining. So now notice, for someone like Brown, in theory, this inadequacy might have been remedied, but in practice, that wasn't happening. And so Brown and his followers said they could no longer wait. Can't wait anymore. And in fact, the title of his most famous work, published in 1582, says it all. It's described, he calls it a treatise of reformation without tarrying for any. So that's the separatist mindset for Brown. We want reformation and no more waiting, no more tarrying, can't do this anymore, no more delay, gentle words failed, strong words failed, parliamentary attempts have failed, everything has failed. So now he says it's time for godly men and women to simply get up and go and do something else. Here's how he described it. He's sort of casting himself here in the prophetic mode, and he is ruthless in his rhetoric. I believe Dr. Renahan called it razor sharp, and that's exactly right. Listen to this. Notice how he's not just ruthless with kind of Church of England bigwigs. He's ruthless with fellow Puritans who he regards as overly complacent and perhaps even cowardly. This is what he says. He says, they say, behold, we have a Christian prince, but the worthy may not tarry for the unworthy, but rather must forsake them, as it is written. And the they here is these Christian, Puritan folks who are kind of like, hey, Robert, chill out, it's okay. He says, they say we have a Christian prince, the worthy may not tarry for the unworthy, but rather forsake them, as it is written, cast not your pearls before swine, nor holy things unto dogs. He that will be saved must not tarry for this man or that. And he that putteth his hand to the plow, and then looketh back, is not fit for the kingdom of God. So just like Moses led God's people out of Egypt, Brown imagined himself leading the godly out of the corrupt and, for all intents and purposes, irredeemable Church of England into a better promised land. Others found this compelling. Separatist contemporaries John Greenwood, Henry Barrow, both of whom agreed that, quote, the situation of the Church of England was one of total apostasy. And so with men like this, we find a second sort of independence, right? We talked about independence from Rome. Now we're talking about English-speaking Protestants who wanted independence from the Church of England. And we can see, if Puritans, you may have heard the description of Puritans as the hotter sort of Protestants, right? Well, if that's what a normal Puritan is, and a guy like Brown is someone the temperature is turned up so high that the stove is starting to malfunction. He's got to get out altogether. And again, they concluded the cause was lost. Here's the historian B.R. White. He describes the separatists in this category as hasty Puritans. And he writes that separatism was the logical policy for Puritans to adopt if their ideals were too long thwarted, or to put it very slightly differently, when their patience was exhausted. So then, a second kind of independence. But what's interesting to me, what's curious is that despite the fiery rhetoric of a man like Robert Brown, the independence he sought from the Church of England was not actually the most radical sort of independence that one might seek from a national church. There was a more radical sort of independence. Radical comes from Latin radix, roots. Think of trying to get down to the very roots of something. We don't want superficial change. We want to pull it up by the roots. And there was actually a more radical kind of independence that emerged. And that brings us to our third form of independence, which, though many of its proponents were much more calm in their rhetoric than Brown, who was quite an intense guy. I think their move was actually more radical. And that brings us to our third independence. Independence from the idea of a national church, the origins and rise of English Congregationalists. So, how do we think about these folks? Well, Brown and other separatists wanted independence from the Church of England because they saw it as hopelessly corrupt, and they were tired of waiting for something to happen that they increasingly thought is not going to happen, at least not in my lifetime. Remember, Reformation without tarrying for any. And they were rejecting then their own national church. But, crucially, in doing so, they're not necessarily rejecting the idea of a national church full stop. They're simply indicating that the national church on offer is not good enough. The national church that is available to us is hopelessly corrupt and mired in popish remnants, and we don't want anything to do with it anymore. They're not actually saying we can't even imagine a national church that would be acceptable to us. That would be a more radical move. That's the truly radical move, to say that any national church, no matter how pure, is not acceptable to a New Testament vision of the church. That's more radical. That goes down deeper to the roots. That's something, interestingly enough, and this will come out again in my subsequent sessions. You know, we don't think, I think, always about how radical that was, because we just live in a context in which that's really not on the table, at least for most of us. And yet, that was the sort of, 1,000-year assumption for European Christendom. There was this Constantinian assumption that church and state and society should all relate in a certain way, and that the kingdom should be a Christian kingdom in the strongest sense, comprehending everyone in the land. Everyone should be a part of the church and the state, and to be a citizen was to be a member of the church, and vice versa, and it all just sort of went together. That is the assumption that is kind of baseline since the Reformation starts. It was baseline going back to Constantine. The reformers did not really question that. Talking about the magisterial reformers anyway, the 16th century, people like Luther and Calvin. That was always a given. Listen to how the historian Rowan Strong describes the Church of England. He says that Henry's church was always a national project, meant first and foremost to be the church of the English, all the English, who would, if necessary, be compelled to come in. So that's what's meant by a national church. And that sort of national church was, again, the unquestioned assumption for medieval and early modern Europeans, Protestants included. Not all Protestants, but magisterial Reformation folks. But then listen, Strong continues. He says, however, that royal agenda of the inclusion of all the English lay at the heart of the problem of this national ecclesiastical project. Why? Well, because, he says, at no time since Henry VIII ushered in his religious revolution did all the English people want to be part of this Church of England. Now, the folks that Strong refers to there include all sorts of people who didn't like the Church of England, right? So it would include people like Robert Brown and the separatists who thought it was corrupt and too popish. It would also include people who were Roman Catholic by conviction and didn't go along with Reformation, and they were sitting there thinking, this is bad, this is false, we're in schism from the Bishop of Rome. So Rowan Strong's comment there includes a whole bunch of people. But what's interesting is, what if you went a further step? What if instead of saying, I don't like the Church of England because it's too Catholic or it's not Catholic enough, what if you said, I don't like the Church of England because it's the Church of England? I don't like the Church of England because it's conceived as a national church that comprehends the whole population. What if you said, that's actually not a New Testament model for the church? That's a much more radical step. It takes it beyond even what the fiery rhetoric of a Robert Brown is doing. And so when we think about that, it brings us to the man we met in the last session, Henry Jacob. Henry Jacob, again, as was described, congregation in Southwark. It's the Jacob Lathrop Jesse Church. So we're back to Jacob again. And what's interesting to me about Jacob is that eventually, Dr. Renahan talked about kind of the development of his thought, but eventually he comes to this place by 1616 in which he is actually prepared to reject the basic logic of a national church. He's basically going to cast aside this idea that had animated Christendom for a very long time. Jacob writes, "Men esteem a whole nation professing the gospel to be one visible church, and they call it a national church." And again, that assumption, one visible church, a national church, that goes back to the start of the Reformation. All the magisterial reformers would have agreed with that. The historian Juan Cameron has put it like this. He says, "From the Reformation's beginning, the founders of Protestantism held that the church must be a comprehensive society, embracing and supervising both the elect and the reprobate, the zealous and the sluggish." Well, again, England's reformers were no different, and so people like John Hooper, who we mentioned before, would have had no quarrel with that vision of the church. People like Henry Jacob, though, start to question it, and they set a lot of things in motion that are still with us here today. Jacob rejected that definition of the church. Listen how he describes a church. He says, "We believe that the nature and essence of Christ's true visible," by visible, or sometimes he'll say that is political. By political, he just means institutional, right? The thing with a concrete reality. The true visible or political church under the gospel is a free congregation of Christians for the service of God, or true spiritual body politic containing no more ordinary congregations, but one, and that independent. So notice then that a church is just a congregation of a gathering of believers in one place. And he says it's independent, meaning that individual congregations are in charge of their own affairs. They answer ultimately to Jesus himself. And that, Jacob says, is what a church is. Now, the interesting thing about that is, in one sense, he's more radically undercutting the reality of the Church of England as a national church. In another way, he actually, as Dr. Renahan says, can be much more kind to the individual congregations that compose the national church than a Robert Brown. So there's this weird mixture. On the one hand, he's actually saying something, I think, much more sort of cutting than Brown, but he can have fellowship with individual churches within the Church of England because he regards those as true churches, or at least potentially. There were some that were too Romish, but you see this again in the so-called apologetical narration, which was the document introduced at the Westminster Assembly by the independent divines. And in that document, if you read through it, they never talk about the Church of England. They talk about the churches of England. Churches, individual churches. This was a big thing for them. It's a big thing for Jacob. In any event, it's a truly radical assertion that he makes there. This is our third development then, this sense of congregational principle, which proved very influential. This is the idea that would be then taken across from the crowded banks of the Thames across the ocean to New England, and it would be instantiated and given life and given opportunity to really develop and to flourish and thrive in New England. And like Jacob, the New England Congregationalists believed that the idea of a national church was not what Christ had intended, and that its adoption in England and elsewhere was an inappropriate carryover from Old Testament forms. Old Testament shadows being brought inappropriately into New Testament worship. And one of the chief spokesmen for New England, John Cotton, he explained it this way. He says, "The whole nation of Israel made but one church, and the officers or ministers of any one synagogue, the priests and Levites, were ministers in common to the whole house of Israel." But he goes on to explain that this ecclesiastical arrangement was intended by God to be temporary. Now, because the churches of the New Testament are of another constitution, I'm not sure that what I'm reading corresponds with what you're seeing, but anyway, we're almost at the end. We'll just go on. He says, now because the churches of New Testament are of another constitution, none of them national, as the Church of Israel was, but all of them congregational. So again, this is fast forward from Jacob. This idea is developed now, but you can see the same basic concern. This idea of a national church, they say, not biblical, not what the New Testament intended. And in doing this, they are breaking long-standing Christendom assumptions, long-standing assumptions about what the church is and should be. Oh, here's the problem. Is that what I just read? That's what I just read. Sorry, my mistake. Anyway, you get the idea. This is a big development for English Christianity and Christianity in general. And it is this, I would argue, this design, this intention for the church that eventually is what gives rise to the Baptistic Congregationalists that get going in the late 1630s and 1640s. This logic of congregationalism, this rejection of the national church, I would argue is tightly tied to the decision, ultimately, the emergence of a Baptistic, credo-Baptistic form of church government. So then, as we look at this, as we set the stage in this way for what's to come, we tried to untangle how you have these three sort of progressive developments, three kinds of independency as I'm framing it. They weren't necessarily framing it in that way. That's my framing for our time together. These three sorts of independencies, we see how they're actually intertwined. They move forward chronologically, and they build on one another. The same spirit of reformation that pressed John Hooper to lament what he saw as England's ongoing commitments to popery. That same spirit of pressing forward for a more thorough reformation is what then animates the English Puritans under Queen Elizabeth. And then separatists like Robert Brown get frustrated with the pace of progress and they want to push it even further. And then perhaps it's just one more step to begin to think with Henry Jacob that, you know what, maybe the real problem, yes, the Church of England is full of popish remnants that we need to get rid of, but maybe the real problem is more fundamental. Maybe the real problem is that we're doing this national church thing in the first place, this trying to comprehend the whole nation. Every baby entering in as a citizen is also a part of the church. Maybe that actually was a wrong move. Maybe that's the more fundamental step. But you can see how these three senses of independency build on one another, and each one sets the stage for the emergence of the next one. When we think about the history of ideas, whether we're thinking about theological ideas or other ideas, it's important to see that ideas don't just sort of drop out of the sky from nowhere. From a human perspective, anyway, ideas are always sort of building and emerging. People are building on what came before. They're tweaking things. They're saying, hey, you know what, maybe the previous generation overemphasized this good thing at the expense of this other good thing. We're always trying to balance and bring into biblical conformity our way of approaching the Christian life and godliness and ecclesiology. The literary scholar Andrew Delbanco has written, quote, "The history of ideas is usually better understood as a process of incorporation and transformation rather than a series of successive movements discrete and distinct from one another." I think that's a fair observation on how the history of ideas works in general, and I think it's applicable to these discussions of ecclesiology. So we've seen three movements here. In my subsequent sessions, we're going to dive a little deeper into some of those developments and try to tease out how different ideas relate to one another. So I look forward to that. Thank you for your attention.